Welcome back, everyone, for this second session of Geneva Trade Week. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Dmitry Grozbinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and it's my pleasure to host this somewhat more relaxed second session after the powerhouse first session in which we had 6 permanent representatives and the representatives of 3 IOs talk about the high-level need to align trade policy with the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the different ways that that conversation is shifting in Geneva, the way that topics that previously would have been, if not taboo, then certainly strangers to the WTO conversation, but perhaps even the conversations within UNCTAD and trade policy more generally, are now more and more commonplace across the landscape. This second session really is our attempt to get, if not into the weeds, then into some of the practicalities. Joining me on stage is my fellow platform director, Katrina Seri. She runs the TASK platform, the Thinking Ahead on Societal Change platform. And while that name may not scream labor, anyone familiar with TASK knows that they have been working tirelessly on the future of work and convening some of these very cross-silo discussions, bringing together all sorts of players to talk about what is the workplace of the future going to look like, how that's going to change our societies. And I'm partially hoping here that I've stolen half of Katrina's introduction, because this is the way that you torture office mates. Joining us online from Harvard is Dr. Adam Storbaker. He is an international lawyer focusing on the regulation of innovation and access to technology, specifically in the health sector. We're very glad he could join us. He comes to us from the Global Health Center, but he's here representing our co-organizers, the International Geneva Global Health Center. And I'm going to give him the floor in just a few minutes to tell us a little bit about both the Health Hub and the Global Health Center and their work. The kind of discussion I want to have today is fundamentally a question about how do we fill rooms like this? How do we have the kind of conversations in trade policy that are interesting to audiences in the health space and in the labor space? How do we answer the questions they have of us, and how do we ask the right questions of them? And that question is one I'll be putting to both of our panelists. But first, Katrina, if you could just give us a flavor for what is TASK and what do you do?
Thank you, Dimitri. Full disclosure, what I do is sit at a desk opposite Dimitri in our office, but not often working on the same topic. So I'm really delighted to be joining the conversation here today and bringing the subject of labor into trade-related discussions. It was really refreshing to hear it being mentioned and to hear that shift in thinking happening in the WTO at the moment. So looking forward to diving in how we can bring more of that. The TASK platform, Thinking Ahead on Societal Change. For those of you familiar with the Geneva Trade Platform, we're a sister platform with a similar structure, but with the aim of targeting large-scale societal transformations that are being tackled by many of the international organizations here in International Geneva, many of the stakeholders around the world, but in different shapes and forms and often in different silos. So the first of those transformations that we've been dealing with since the platform's inception around 3 years ago is the future of work. As Dimitri said, this is really a cross-cutting topic which finds its home in the International Labour Organization here in Geneva, but work and labor and the accompanying factors of technology, workplace, digitization, etc., find their home in many organizations. Practically what we do, we connect different voices on this subject through discussions, through events. We convene Future of Work summits with the same fantastic event manager who's coordinating the Geneva Trade Week, Joanita Kalibala. So you can get a flavor of how our events are run. We inform, we have a quarterly newsletter, we publish blogs and policy briefs. and research publications on hot topics in the space of the future of work. I think the most interesting thing we do is under the subject of innovation. So that's really bringing together thinking on new ideas and on slightly old ideas like the intersection of trade and labor, but coming into a new sense and ideas that don't necessarily find their home here in Geneva or anywhere else. So we help to host and shape those. I think the distinction is in the title of the subject matter, the future of work. So we bring in elements of foresight and future thinking into some of that work that we do beyond topics of trade and labor. We think about things like gender, like future generations, like youth, and like bringing more diverse voices into envisaging the future.
I think it would surprise a lot of people to realize just how exceptional this notion of a platform that brings together labor with other spheres of policy is in a Geneva context. I was a delegate here for 3 years. Not only did I not once visit the ILO, I can count on one hand the number of times I spoke with a colleague who worked on labor at all. Despite Geneva having this reputation as an international city, despite it having all of these different elements together, it is only in events like yours that you really do have someone sit down and say, okay, well, how do we get these people to talk to these people, to talk to these people about the thing that they would all, if asked, say is of mutual importance. I really do encourage everyone to have a look at the task's work, because it is one of the very few places these conversations are happening. And I think they're really important conversations. So thank you very much for joining us, Katrina.
Thank you.
Adam, on that score, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of an introduction to the two organizations whose kind of flags you're flying here for us today, and of course a little bit about your own work as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, although online. And I wished I were there in person, especially for all the breakfasts and receptions and what have you. So as Dimitri already mentioned, I work at the Global Health Center at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And let me say a couple of words about the Global Health Platform. So the Global Health Platform is the convening arm of the Global Health Center. It is funded by the Swiss government. And the Global Health Platform brings together diverse global health actors in international Geneva and beyond to collaborate, build synergies, build capacities, and especially in global health diplomacy. So kind of the collaboration between sectors is already inscribed in our mission as well. And each year, the Global Health Platform organizes around 20 events on topics which included pandemic product research and development, pandemic financing, digital health, or civil society participation, among others. And aside from organizing these events, the Global Health Center also hosts a number of research projects and policy outreach projects. And I have been a researcher for governing pandemics projects, where we follow the ongoing negotiations in the global health space. So the negotiations of a new pandemic instrument, some would call it pandemic treaty, and the amendment of the international health regulations. We also host another project, New Business Models for Innovation and Access to Medicines, which seeks to study new business arrangements that could improve the satisfaction of global health needs globally. So in my introduction, I already mentioned issues such as R&D, business models, and there are just so many topics that sit at this intersection of health and trade. So it's great to have this conversation and to try to exchange our insight between the sectors, but also to be conscious of how, for example, trade really affects health. And I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Adam. As you said, so many of the issues you work on and that the hub and the center work on are at the intersection of trade and health. And I think if we trade folk were being honest, far, far more people are interested in health and health outcomes and the impact of global health policy on their lives than they are in trade policy for its own sake. Trade is fundamentally a means to other ends, whereas health is an end in and of itself. So I think the fact that so many of the things you work on aren't always at the top of our radar, and that a lot of the things that the center works on happens in a silo from our community and vice versa, really reflects a failure of imagination on our part and a failure to reach people where they live in a lot of ways. So I'm really glad you could join us. I'm really glad we could do this with the health and labor communities. Adam, I wonder if I could stay with you. In the previous panel, one of the first words out of the mouths of several of the ambassadors when asked for reflections on the SDGs was COVID. There was a sense that COVID for them had been emblematic of a changing world, but also a world that reflected the disparities between developed and developing countries. It revealed what they felt were iniquities and fragilities in the system. And I think they were making that comment as national representatives, but also as trade permanent representatives to the WTO. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the health community saw trade through the COVID context.
Yeah, thank you. To start, I think for both communities, what was really highlighted by this crisis, which was a crisis of also of international cooperation, was that was coming to a conclusion that health, public health, and trade operate in a system of global interdependence. So, for example, health, what we sometimes in academia would call regime complexity. So health operates in this context where it interacts with other regimes, such as trade. And this is particularly true for subfields such as research and development of pandemic products, which rely on global exchange between states with regards to sharing of information, but also of raw materials. And however, despite the situation of a global interdependence, we do lack legal frameworks that would ensure cooperation in a situation of a public health emergency. And this was really brought home by the crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm an international lawyer, and for me, COVID-19 has demonstrated how cooperation can quickly unravel in a situation of an emergency. And I think all of us became slightly more realist in our thinking about how cooperation operates in times of emergency. So what is kind of brought home for the health community, and what I keep hearing in meetings with experts, is that there is overarching importance of having frameworks established before the next pandemic. So we have this concept of panic and neglect that usually how we operate, it really depends on a appearance of an emergency where everyone kind of tries to get together and tries to maximize their own interest. But then when the pandemic is over, there is often neglect because it's just so difficult to invest in prevention and to prove the return on investment in the case of prevention. However, this is really a historic opportunity to establish some frameworks and to think in systemic terms. So trade is one of the regimes where having certain rules for how to govern the movement and exchange of goods and the intellectual property could be beneficial to health outcomes. However, also maybe trade will not save us in the global health space. So it's necessary to think in systemic terms about issues such as investment in R&D, putting conditions on public financing, and also addressing business models which have worked better for access to medicines. So trade is one of the components in this kind of jigsaw puzzle, but we have to look at it systematically and address it across the regimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. That notion of panic and neglect definitely resonates with anyone in the trade policy community. Fundamentally, trade rules and trade agreements are actually pretty bad at addressing distortions that already exist, but have a slightly better trade record at preventing problems, provided that they can be agreed. The rules can be agreed when no one's thinking about doing what they seek to prevent. So it's fascinating to hear that this kind of phenomenon of harvesting when it's possible resonates with health, though it sounds like perhaps they suffer the same sort of shortfalls that we do in trade. On that notion of kind of preventing some of the potential challenges or disturbances of the future, Katrina, in addition to sharing an office, you and I share a strategic director for our centers, Professor Richard Baldwin, one of whose grand theses talks about the move from to a system where services are increasingly traded across borders electronically. And he speaks about what will happen when workers who have never previously had to face competition from abroad suddenly find themselves competing on the global market. I wonder if you had any reflections on what trade policy should be thinking about in terms of how that might shape the labor conversation and how that might shape politics as labor does.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea is that as we move on to online work, knowledge workers are increasingly facing competition from overseas. It's not a new story. In the task platform, when we think about the future of work, we face two big threats, really, twin trends of tech and trade, which have similar impacts on the workforce. The big conversation that kicked off the whole Future of Work Summit is will technology steal our jobs? Will robots take our work? And the flip side of that is, are workers in other countries going to take our work? This trend of work on digital platforms and service trade across borders is kind of a culmination of that, is workers and technology across countries, across borders, going to take our jobs here in developed countries. So it's putting a bit of a new spin on an old competition, but it still comes down to the same challenges of disrupted workforces as we face industrial transformations. And the answer has traditionally been around active labor market policies, so things that Mr. Lee was talking about in the last panel from the ILO. How do we support workers in understanding the changes that are heading their way, and upskilling, reskilling to meet those changes, plus having the kind of supporting factors from governments, from national and local governments to help move workers into new industries where necessary, and to do that job matching and to develop new industries if those old ones are no longer suitable in the face of new global competition. So bringing into space those new active labor market policies that we've seen in extractives and manufacturing, now they're starting to hit white collar workers, which is making people really sit up and pay attention. If I can continue, in the trade space, this is the kind of conversation that tends to, I guess, dominate around the displacement of workers due to trade. But I think a second theme that's coming up that we've had our eye on is around decent work, and that's more from the exporting rather than the importing countryside. And it's much harder to measure, and less work has been done on measuring the impacts of trade and working standards, labor standards in this space. So it's looking at bringing in those kind of ILO working conventions into agreements across international borders as well.
There's a lot to unpack there, I think, about the future, and some interesting parallels with health as well. You know, you referred to active labor market policies, active interventions by governments in the market. You spoke about sort of the kind of transition assistance, support assistance, helping workers understand what's coming, helping them adapt and advance, helping them learn skills. But of course, there is a flip side to this kind of active market policies, which is, rather than helping workers adjust, governments may choose to simply try to limit how much competition they get from abroad. And, you know, those of us in trade will say, well, listen, on paper, a lot of those kind of interventions are actually currently illegal under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, for example. But as we learned during the health pandemic, when it comes to issues of genuine national interest and sensitivities, as Adam was saying, we can quickly reach the limits of how binding international agreements really are when the rubber hits the road. So it's interesting to hear those parallels. It's also really interesting to hear that these kind of questions of flanking policies and support are foremost in the minds of the labor conversation, because I think those of us in trade would say we've never really gotten those right. Is that, I wonder if actually, I might stay with you for a second and throw that back to you. We briefly spoke about manufacturing. Is there a sense among labor that we did that right, or did we drop the ball in terms of helping workers adjust to greater competition from abroad and robotics?
I think this goes back to the discussion that was happening on the last panel around the shift in thinking that's happening at the WTO at the moment. So I think it was Alice who spoke about her work in 2016, where she gathered people together to talk about environmental issues. And they said, is this us in the ILO? And some of when it comes to labor, I think the addition that was made by the ambassador from Mauritius was even more accurate around, this is one more condition that's being added to the list. We started our discussion within the task platform on trade and labor and the interlinkages in this space tentatively around 2021. And I think that question still came up. Could it be us? And hearing the conversation that's happening in the environment space, where it's moving beyond the removal of barriers to trade to thinking about trade as an enabler for international development, for the SDGs, for decent work. The key issue that comes up, I think, in this intersection between trade and labor is the role trade can play in tackling inequalities. We know that trade can have huge positive impacts on countries, but as Mr. Lee said earlier, that impact is not often equally distributed. So how can trade play a role in spreading that distribution more equally? I think the next stage of this conversation involves revisiting a little how we think about those legal standards and stepping into the gray areas that were mentioned as well.
And as the labor community is jumping up and down and saying, have a look at distribution, have a look at the changing workforce, Adam, I wonder if I could turn to you and ask, what is, to the extent that it is looking at us at all, which I appreciate might be marginal, what are the things that the health policy community is looking at trade policymakers and trade and wishing we what's on the agenda, and what do you wish was on our agenda?
Right. So trade really structures a lot of health outcomes, and definitely one topic that has been on the agenda, as far as I can remember, was the question of intellectual property rules governing basically access to medication. And there are now proposals. There has been the partial waiver, and the discussions are about the extension. And this is a very important discussion. The only thing is that it's been quite stagnant for a while. So it's important to make a connection kind of to points that were mentioned already. So thinking about it in systemic terms, as in looking also at other drivers of access. So thinking beyond the overarching legal rules, but also thinking about, for example, the structure of an enterprise. Is it a corporation? Is it a public benefit corporation? Is it a small business? What kind of arrangement worked in the past to guarantee better outcomes? This also relates to what Kitrona said about the benefits of potential benefits of trade. And in that regard, I think it's important to argue also that having clear rules. So for example, putting conditions on public funding when the governments fund R&D for countermeasures for medical products putting conditions in place that would guarantee better access to these medicines. And most of the money comes from the government. So it's important to be conscious about this possibility. And look, I really believe that having international rules, maybe it won't allow us to rein in these animal instincts that seem to prevail in an event of an emergency, but they can set in place an environment, an ecosystem that could result in increased access to medicines and technology. So having clear rules could increase legal certainty, exchange of information, and actually result also in better outcomes for global R&D by allowing firms to scale it up. So it's I do believe it's an interest of everyone to establish rules in the interpandemic times. And I wish there was more discussion between the sectors about how to do this. Another issue concerns the, for example, distributed manufacturing. And Jeremy Farrar recently made a proposal for having smaller countries host some of the manufacturing. So I think it's one of these proposals where, again, we may acknowledge that it may be difficult to ensure cooperation during an emergency, but we may prepare for them. And by having smaller countries take up manufacturing, they may be less incentivized because they have smaller populations to look after their own population, and therefore may be more incentivized to share the products, the fruits of science with other countries. So basically looking at the different regimes and how they cooperate with each other, trade, health, investment, there is a need to address procurement and financing, and looking at these and having communities of practice meet together and discuss how this can be addressed in real terms is something I would really like to see more of. It's just that everyone seems to be very consumed by everything that's happening in the respective space, and in health, for me, it's okay. I can work on it full time, but for members of smaller delegations, it's just difficult to follow all the processes that are going on. So there is a lot of space for building capacities, providing space for discussions, for honest discussions, and allowing people to exchange and to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think that really brings us to the core of what I wanted to put to you both. And Adam got us started there with a couple of ideas on how do you actually, I mean, it's easy to talk about breaching the silos in theory. It's easy to talk about it as a high-level ideal. I think the ambassadors made that point. The representatives of the IOs made that point. But I think the proof is in kind of the pudding, and the challenge is in the execution. You have delegates who, as Adam said, might be stretched 15 different directions, trying to cover a plethora of debates around Geneva. You have other delegates that, again, as Adam said, can work exclusively on health. And I'm sure Adam has more than enough work in just health to last him several lifetimes. So I think TASK especially has had to crack that nut harder than most, because unlike GTP, which comes with a very large built-in trade audience that is a natural group to reach out to, you really had to start from scratch. So I wonder if you had any wisdom you can share on how to cut this Gordian knot that Adam described.
Wisdom, I'm not sure, but I can certainly say a little about what we've been testing and trying out in the TASK platform over the last couple of years. In particular, on this topic of trade and labor, we started exploring this topic, as I said, around 2021 with a small group of delegates of around 10 countries from across the missions in Geneva. And it was an initial couple of workshops exploring whether there is indeed appetite to revitalize this conversation on the interlinkages between trade and labor, and where those interests and low-hanging fruit could be. And I think what came out was the intersection, to make things even more intersectional, between what is not a particularly hot topic. It's a topic that's been around for a while, that people are perhaps even a bit disillusioned by, with the new trends and new interests that are coming up at the moment, and looking at the levers that revitalizing this connection can bring to tackling some of the challenges that we face today. Examples are in the digital space, so new technologies coming to the forefront. They're of course putting pressure on workforces and putting pressure on trade. So what are the connections between trade and labor, and how can we help meet our mutual aims? Where are we stronger together than apart in this space? Another of the topics is the just transition. Environment is coming up, and along with environment, there's always like a last line that says, and there should be a just transition for workers. So the aim is to put a little bit more meat to the bones of that subject. And I think the one that's most powerful at the moment is this question of human rights due diligence, labor standards that is really starting to show teeth in international regulations and policies at the moment. But the challenge that companies are facing is it's really a plurilateral move. It's coming bilaterally or from small groups of countries who are setting their own policies in this space. It's not coming from the large international organizations. Well, not coming from the WTO. Essentially, it's a move to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and ILO basic standards. So the WTO accepts that there is a role in that. A lot of policy, trade policies mention it, but it's around putting some practicalities behind that. And where people see interest in advancing their agenda, they're often interested in coming to the table around those specific topics. So that's what we're doing in our current project. We're working with the World Economic Forum on this with support from the Louders Foundation, and aiming to bring together exactly what Adam suggested, communities of practice on trade and labor. We're right at the inception, so we'll let you know how that goes.
I suppose if I were to try to summarize that in a kind of guiding principle, it sounds like what you are doing is trying to identify topics that are kind of in the zeitgeist and of interest already, and then teasing out where the intersections might be and trying to create the kind of spaces that will generate interesting conversations about those, rather than trying to, I suppose, create new areas of interest unilaterally. Would that be a fair way to characterize it?
Or to try and revisit areas that have been discussed plenty in the past. So to bring a new energy and a new perspective to those discussions where they're most needed today. I think also the important thing is bringing some new stakeholders. And from my side, the one that sits right in the middle of the trade neighbor nexus is multinational corporations. And the pressure they're facing on their supply chains, and having more transparency, having more due diligence through their supply chains, but not seeing that coherence in policy.
Adam, on that last point that Katrina brought up about multinational corporations, my gut instinct, speaking from a true position of ignorance, is that when it comes to MNCs and health versus their position in the trade space, I think in the trade space, there is a sense that MNCs might drive policy, whereas in the health space, it might be somewhat different. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what you see as the role of the private sector, and especially the large-scale private sector in the kind of health and trade conversations we should be having.
Yeah, that's a great discussion. Honestly, and I don't think there is a consensus because your perspective on this topic will depend whether you represent whether you represent a country with big pharmaceutical industry, and kind of coming to down to the general role. The industry has obviously a very important role in production and development of countermeasures. Now, the question is, how should it bear on the international negotiations, right? So the answer to that, so far, what we've seen, it really will depend. The preferences would depend. Obviously, the industry has a lot of power as an actor in international affairs that just because of the structure of the whole market and how it can influence governments. And there were arguments made that COVID has demonstrated the important role of the industry and manufacturing developing countermeasures. However, any agreement on the international stage, I think there is a consciousness that it would have to be primarily an agreement between states. And that kind of also gets us to another discussion of when you negotiate agreement between states, which may have different interests. There is also a question of how to make the industry compliant with an agreement, which may or may not be entirely in its interest. So there were different, throughout the current negotiations, there were different proposals of how to do this, whether to do this through domestic legal systems, or whether to have an international system of allocation of products of science. And without going kind of into the details, the role of the industry is something to be accounted for. And the industry, it's important also to nuance I speak about it as it was a uniform body, but in practice, there is also an important role for industry from especially from middle income countries, that has played an enormous role in access to medicines throughout the pandemic. And the new business models for pharmaceutical innovation and access project at the Global Health Center really looks into that. So stay tuned for some academic articles. But it basically looks at how business models, especially in middle-income countries, and not only the big Western pharma, but the businesses in middle-income countries have played a crucial role in generating access to fruits of science. So it's important to differentiate because even within industry, there may be groups with different interests and different composition. So while the industry is it's always important to take it into consideration, it's also important to think of how to diversify the space or how to account for interests of developing countries by addressing the role of the industry as well. Over to you.
Thank you. Some really interesting reflections there. And again, a link back to the fact that in trade, we have a small and medium enterprises agenda. But I think that was the first time I've heard anyone articulate the role of medium enterprises, specifically in the dissemination of what you in the health community apparently call countermeasures, which is a fantastic way to describe them. And it's kind of, we in the trade community spend a lot of time discussing what are the policy interventions we can make that can support small and medium enterprises that are competitive domestically, becoming competitive internationally, and being able to bring their products beyond the borders of a developing country. And this is the first time I've ever heard of that described as a potential health force multiplier. And I think it really does speak to how much of the conversation we're missing. We have just a few more minutes before I'll throw it over to Q&A. For those of you joining us online, if you have questions, please do drop them in the Q&A box. It's right there at the bottom of your Zoom, and our lovely colleague Joanne will read it. We'll read your questions out in a faintly Germanic accent, which will lend them gravitas. So please do, for those of you in the room, we will just hand you a mic and you can throw your questions straight at us. But I wonder if I could just throw a final kind of reflection before we get to Q&A at each of you and ask, really, if we get to the nuts and bolts, Adam, what would what would be the features of a trade conversation that you think the GHC's kind of community engagement, those that come to your meetings, those that follow your products, what would trade content have to include in order to start attracting their interest and participation? And then Katrina, I'll throw the same question to you on the labor side.
Thank you, Dimitri. So it would have to include the perspective, taking into account the perspective of health systems and of improving access to fruits of science. It would have to probably the most in-demand kind of work that we hear about is producing some digestible research and backing it up with some case studies of what has worked in the trade space, what has worked for health outcomes in particular, and seeing how it worked in practice in a shorter form and having a discussion about what can be done to address it across sectors. It's something that would definitely attract the attention of delegates. And we mentioned that delegates and everyone basically in International Geneva just runs from meeting to meeting. So it would the research would have to be provided in a form that is digestible, but would also have to address this intersection and provide a space for discussion of how this kind of the models that have worked in the past, how they can be reproduced in the future before it is too late, and have a discussion about how this could be done throughout sectors. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I mean, Adam's kind of description, there were things about what we should target. This question of access to fruits of science. There was questions about which voices we should have in the room, this notion of having health systems be there. I think there was also a really good question and sort of a notion of data and case studies, which is really an informational deficit that we have. As Adam was saying that, my immediate thought was, how would I even go about getting that kind of information within my community of trade's impact on health? And the answer is almost certainly it would require some reaching across these siloed aisles. Katrina, I wonder if you had any reflections from the Labour side.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to turn the question back, I think, a little to the trade community, because in my experience so far, there is quite a lot of appetite from the many different stakeholders that are working on the Labour side to speak about trade in its many shapes and forms and the impacts of trade. And the trade community is perhaps the toughest to engage in that conversation. I think because of some preconceptions of the historical conversation on this topic. So I think diffusing some of that nervousness, I think getting over the question of protectionism. There's some really nice research that's coming out at the moment from the ILO around the promoting and enforcing compliance in labor agreements that tackles some of these issues and shows that complaints being raised and not around protectionism. There's been no sanctions, there's been no disruptions to trade policies, and really the work happening between countries in this space is around cooperation, around capacity building, and around building dialogue between the multiple stakeholders on the ground in a difficult space. We had the topic of social dialogue coming up, which is already complicated, the dialogue between workers, organizations, and governments. When that happens across borders, it adds another level of complexity. So that's a space where engagement from both sides is especially needed. What we're doing along the lines that Adam suggested is going to country and industry level and really engaging people who are in the same context on some of these conversations, and hoping that going down to that level helps to get to the nitty-gritty of the subjects, get beyond the nice conversations we're having here where we're saying the conversation needs to happen, we're ready to hear it. What is it? So trying to get into what it means on the ground to have these conversations, and hopefully some learnings will come out of that can be scaled up to the multilateral level.
It's not an easy task you've set for either of, I think, our communities. As you said, I'm glad that there is interest on the labor side to engage. On the trade side, I think despite some of the high level messages we heard in the previous panel, there is a tendency to be defensive, to be paranoid of what fresh hell is this, and how will it take away my market access, or how will it carve out new market access I had no intention of giving. And I think if there's one thing both of these panels really speak to, it's the need to move beyond that kind of thinking if we want to start kicking the goals that I think politicians expect us to kick as policy communities, and I think people expect us to achieve. With that, I wonder if I could throw open the floor if there are any questions online or in the room. Anyone feeling particularly brave to heckle our speakers? Otherwise, I'll do it, and that's...
Please.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Edna Ramirez. I'm professor of international economic law at the Universidad de Guadalajara in Mexico. I'm curious to hear your views on the disputes that have happened in the USMCA context lately, as they have been, most of them, labor disputes. So I would like to hear if that's a path that could be taken into account for the multilateral discussion. Thank you.
Katrina, I think that sits somewhat within your wheelhouse.
I think so. Here I would admit that I'm not an expert in the trade policy space, although by overseeing these projects, I am getting a taste and a flavor. So I know that dispute has been discussed and has been part of the research of the study I just mentioned by the ILO. I think some of the interesting learnings that are coming out of this and other disputes from, for example, Korea, Guatemala, Colombia, etc., are around as I said, the need for conversation and collaboration, but also a joint commitment from both countries to engage in this conversation and make their way through this process to support the national governments in meeting the standards that are being asked by the other side, and in understanding what support needs to be given to make that happen. So that's a very uneducated response to your question, generalized. But I do urge you to look at that paper from the ILO. It's called Promoting and Enforcing Compliance with Labor Provisions in Trade Agreements, and compares the approaches of Canada, the EU, and the US in tackling these kind of issues.
I think I mean, the only thing I would, I guess, add to that is that it is fascinating to now watch labor provisions really for the first time be tested by trade law, as well as this kind of meta notion of the idea of trading some access to one's market in exchange for certain labor conditions provisions, whether it's the right to unionize or, as in the USMCA, very controversially, literally minimum wage levels at certain factories. This kind of notion of, can we use these mechanisms to drive that kind of change? And the whole debate that has sparked about, well, what is that good? Is that the way forward for increasing quality of life in a country like Mexico that is next door to the US and has that market on its border? It's a fascinating discussion that we're having really for the first time in trade, when previously it was carved out in a sub-chapter that just said, enforce your own laws, and none of this is subject to dispute settlement. So it's a bold new world, and it's interesting to see where it goes. We had a question down the front. Thank you so much, Professor.
Oh gosh, you almost stole my question. But coming to what, Dimitri, you said about cutting the Gordian knot and countermeasures from Adam, and I really appreciate both speakers. You were absolutely fantastic. It occurs to me that historically speaking, I mean, the WTO, the GATT, were in the ILO building. What has changed since then? Why do you say that labor is not as important as trade? What are the countermeasures? I wrote down some other words here that were so telling about the conversation, which was really fantastic. But how does one take control of the dialogue? Because the ILO was there. Why is it not today?
I'm going to obliquely answer that question because it's far too large. By throwing it to Adam, something that was fascinating to watch in the COVID waiver kind of discussion is the success of campaigners in raising the COVID waiver to the top of the WTO's agenda. Is one of the only outcomes out of the last ministerial conference. managed to, for example, have the US come out for the first time, and to the shock of everyone, in support, at least notionally, of a waiver. And to speak directly to your question, health was way more important than trade for those campaigners and for delegates that were being swayed by the arguments those campaigners made. So I wonder if you could share a little bit of what you saw, what you learned from that campaign, what made it effective. How did health manage to succeed in not only breaking into the trade silo, but really kicking at least one of the doors open?
So I cannot really speak of how it opened the doors of trade. I think it kind of came from a position of very understood anger at what happened with the breakdown of cooperation during the pandemic. So this already created a political momentum which allowed this situation to occur and to materialize. And listen, this kind of comes back to our discussion about the panic and neglect. And in the situation of panic, emergency, some as we witnessed in the beginning of the crisis, the cooperation can break down, but it may also create a political momentum for reform after the breakdown of cooperation. And kind of putting it in these broad terms, I think the anger, the totally justified anger at how governments did not cooperate and how certain high-income countries hoarded vaccines without sharing them, opened the way for proposals across multiple fora, and trade is one of the most important because it structures what we can do in health. So I think there was a natural kind of forum selection for this issue was WTO, and it succeeded because of how, but it kind of was embedded in a bigger structure of how power operates internationally. That would be my answer. But also because you mentioned the role of campaigners. Campaigners have been, civil society has been crucial to the health space and to access to medicines. And there were multiple campaigns around this topic, but also previously with HIV and with tobacco control. So we have a long history of civil society engagement. And it's super important to have it in place and to allow for participation of civil society in the ongoing debates, because civil society can also bring perspectives of local stakeholders that otherwise would not be audible in a room and could not be audible in a room in international Geneva. So it's important to think when we progress with this, how to ensure participation of civil society and local stakeholders, communities, and to ensure that their voice is heard in these meetings. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. I wonder on that if I could go to Katrina. Two of the things Adam talked about were justified anger and presence. Thinking on labor issues right now, we're in an interesting labor moment. For example, in the US, just about every creative involved in the entertainment industry is on strike right now, from the writers to the actors. And there is this sense of a, at least in the zeitgeist, a shift between how employees and employers are viewing each other, perhaps a generational change in how you describe it. At the same time, the WTO remains probably one of the most closed off intergovernmental processes one can imagine. I know others are just as locked out, but certainly one of the delegates on the stage told a story about what happens when she tried to introduce a civil society voice. Do you sense that there might be a wave of the same kind of activism coming to trade policy from labor? And if so, how can we make sure that we are as inclusive as possible?
Yes, I think so. I think that activism comes from two angles as well. There's the one on the civil society and the trade union side, which is seeing a real revitalization as that employer-employee contract and relationship is broken down with the rise of impermanent contracts, zero-hour contracts, platform work. where workers don't have the same security they used to have and are really starting to clock on and push back to that with the help of some really strong and concerted union support to raise that voice. That's really being felt at the ILO, and I think through those ripples will eventually be felt in the trade space. And I think those ripples pass through the business side, the employer's side, as I said before. So businesses are under pressure from workers to kind of tackle some of these efficiencies that they've been driving the last few years and saying, okay, how do we now make that work if we have to pull back on some of this kind of growth and industry transformation that we've had through these new technologies? And the other side of pressure is what I mentioned earlier around ESG requirements, around the strengthening of labor standards being asked for certain countries, and in particular the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that really crystallized government responsibility and to protect and business responsibility to respect human rights, and gave shape and form to that could then be turned into policy and could be pushed for and promoted by civil society and by business in tandem, who are looking for coherence in this space from organizations like ILO and WTO. So I don't know why these organizations are not talking to each other, but we're working on this because the calls to strengthen that relationship are, if not coming from the two organizations, then at least coming from other stakeholders. So hopefully that will at least create some more new dialogue and new ideas in the space.
I think the hope of new dialogue and new ideas in the space is a wonderful place to close the session. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you, Katrona. Thank you to our partners at GHC and, of course, at TASK, and to all of you for joining us. This has been the second Geneva Trade Week session. We hope to see you at the others throughout the week and, of course, at our receptions. And thank you all again.